As I prepared for today, I found myself thinking about what it means to be part of God's family. And the image of all of creation groaning together, suffering labor pains, fits my experience of this strange time. And so, even though through the suffering, I hope. Brothers and sisters, we have an obligation. But it isn't an obligation to ourselves to live our lives on the basis of selfishness. If you live on the basis of selfishness, you are going to die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the actions of the body, you will live. All who are led by God's Spirit are God's sons and daughters. You didn't receive a spirit of slavery to lead you back again into fear, but you received a spirit that shows you are adopted as his children. With this spirit we cry, Abba, Father. That same spirit agrees with our spirit that we are God's children. But if we are children, we are also heirs. We are God's heirs and fellow heirs with Christ, if we really suffer with him, so that we can also be glorified with him. I believe that the present suffering is nothing compared to the coming glory that is going to be revealed to us. The whole creation waits breathless with anticipation for the revelation of God's sons and daughters. Creation was subjected to frustration not by its own choice. It was the choice of the one who subjected it, but in the hope that the creation itself will be set free from slavery to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of God's children. We know that the whole of creation is groaning together and suffering labor pains up until now. And it's not only the creation. We ourselves who have the Spirit as the first crop of the harvest also groan inside as we wait to be adopted and for our bodies to be set free. We were saved in hope. If we see what we hope for, that isn't hope. Who hopes for what they already see? But if we hope for what we don't see, we wait for it with patience.
John Lewis has been on my mind and in my heart since I heard about his death on Friday night. As I reflected on his life over the last 36 hours, I realized that I have looked on him with a certain level of awe. Awe at his commitment that led him to put his own life in danger, and awe that his leadership started at such a young age. He was the youngest speaker at the 1963 March on Washington, offering a speech that the elder advisors pressured him to tone down. One change that he was pressured to make seems particularly prescient to me. In the original version, Lewis opened by boldly declaring that SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which he helped form, wouldn't support President Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill because it didn't go far enough to protect people from police brutality. In the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, we see that the issue hasn't gone away. Yet because of that pressure before he gave his speech, Lewis's words were tempered to, "It is true that we support the administration's Civil Rights Bill. We support it with great reservation, however." John Lewis, of course, knew police brutality all too well. This image for me is iconic. John Lewis being beaten by police for walking across a bridge. The day, March 7th, 1965, became known as Bloody Sunday. It was hardly his first experience of violence as a white response to the demand for civil rights. Lewis was one of the original 13 Freedom Riders, the group of black and white activists who challenged segregated interstate travel in the South in 1961. This picture is of Mr. Lewis and a fellow Freedom Rider, James Werg, after they were attacked. Lewis was left unconscious in a pool of his own blood outside the Greyhound bus terminal in Montgomery, Alabama, after he and others were attacked by hundreds of white people, attacked by segregationists in Montgomery, Alabama in May 1961. Mr. Lewis was arrested 40 times from 1960 to 1966. He was repeatedly beaten senseless by Southern policemen and freelance hoodlums. He spent countless days and nights in county jails and 31 days in Mississippi's notorious Parchman Penitentiary. What I didn't know about him until I read some articles this past weekend was that this had, in addition to the physical cost, a high personal cost. Mr. Lewis's first arrest came in 1960 when he and other students demanded service at whites-only lunch counters in Nashville. David Halberstam, who was a reporter for the Nashville Tennessean at the time, later described the scene. The protests had been conducted with exceptional dignity, and gradually one image came to prevail, that of elegant, courteous, young Black people holding to their Gandhian principles, seeking the most elemental of rights, while being assaulted by young white hoodlums who beat them and on occasion extinguished cigarettes on their bodies. It took 3 months, but the sit-ins were successful and Nashville became the first major Southern city to begin desegregating public facilities. But in the process, Mr. Lewis lost his family's goodwill. When his parents learned that he had been arrested in Nashville, he wrote, they were ashamed. They had taught him as a child to accept the world as he found it. And when he asked them about signs that said colored only, they told him, that's the way it is. Don't get into trouble. But as an adult, he said, after he met Dr. King and Rosa Parks, whose refusal to give up her bus seat to a white man was the flashpoint for the civil rights movement, he was inspired to get into trouble. Good trouble, necessary trouble. Mr. Lewis never stopped getting into trouble, into good trouble, into necessary trouble. At age 76, he participated in another sit-in. This one was on the floor of the House of Representatives. He and other members of Congress demanded that the then Republican-led House vote on gun control legislation. This was in a direct response to the massacre at a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, called The Pulse. Through that action, though that action did not succeed in getting gun control legislation to the House's floor, it was, in my assessment, more good trouble. I hear in today's scripture a call to get into good trouble. I believe that the present suffering, Paul wrote, is nothing compared to the coming glory that is going to be revealed to us. The whole creation waits breathless with anticipation for the revelation of God's children. We know that the whole creation is groaning together and suffering labor pains up until now. And it's not only the creation. We ourselves who have the Spirit as the first crop of the harvest also groan inside as we wait to be adopted and for our bodies to be set free. I hear in Paul's words the desire for something more, the desire for something still being born, the desire for what Martin Luther King Jr. called the beloved community. It is the same desire I hear in John Lewis's call to get into good trouble. It's the same desire I hear from young leaders like Greta Thunberg, who has now held her 100th Fridays for Future strike for the climate, calling for meaningful, efficacious action on the climate crisis. It's the same desire I hear in the calls for justice in the Black Lives Matter movement and from LGBTQ plus activists. It's the same desire I hear from advocates for people who are unhoused. Now, when we look at these struggles, when we look at the plagues of racism, of the climate crisis, of sexual oppression, of economic injustice, it is easy to be discouraged. When we look at how the pandemic has forced us to shelter in place when we want to be out in the streets, it may be helpful to listen to this piece of advice tweeted by Congressman John Lewis in 2018. Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and to get into good trouble, necessary trouble. Like many leaders of faith communities, I've been thinking about how the church can be the church now in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and about how we will be the church when the pandemic is contained and it is safe for us to gather in person again. As I've done this musing this past week, the sage advice from the Reverend Dr. John Dorhauer that was shared last week during the question and response time echoes in my ear, that we can't truly plan for life after the trauma until we are out of the trauma. So I'm trying not to get too specific as I look to the future. Nonetheless, I have reached some conclusions, and the most important conclusion, I think, is this. I hope that we do not go back to the old ways of being church. I hope that we go forward. And when it comes to addressing the pressing and urgent issues of our day, like racism, the climate crisis, sexual oppression, economic injustice, I hope that we go forward. Just as we are being forced to find new ways of being church over the past 4 months, when we haven't been able to gather physically, we will have an opportunity to find new ways of loving our neighbors, new ways of embracing the inescapable reality that our shared future relies on our reliance on one another, our responsibility to one another. And as followers of Jesus, we know there is a better way to do so. 4 years ago, John Lewis was interviewed by John Baptiste, the band leader of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. And I'll let John Lewis conclude today's sermon with a brief clip from that interview.
In 1961, the same year that President Barack Obama was born, black people and white people couldn't be seated together on a Greyhound bus or a Trailway bus, leaving Washington. And in May of 1961, my seatmate was a young white gentleman. The two of us left Washington, and we arrived at the Greyhound bus station in Rock Hill, South Carolina. A group from the Klan beat us, left us lying in a pool of blood when we tried to enter this so-called white waiting room. Now this is May 1961. Many years later, to be exact, in February of '09, one member of the Klan, one of the guys who had beaten us in his 70s, came to my office in Washington with his son in his 40s. And he said, "Mr. Lewis, I'm one of the people that beat you, your seatmate." He said, "Will you forgive me? I want to apologize." And his son started crying. He started crying, and I said, "I accept your apology. I forgive you. They hugged me, I hugged them back, and I started crying. And that's the power of the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence. As Dr. King said, hate is too heavy a burden to bear.
Hate is too heavy a burden to bear.
Yes. So we just, love is a better way.